Welcome to the Book Reading and Summaries channel.
The Godfather, Part 1, The Wedding. It was a perfect summer afternoon on Long Island, 1945. The kind of day when even the air seemed to shimmer with celebration. The Corleone family estate, usually a fortress of silence and respect, was now alive with laughter, music, and the smell of roasted meats. The Don's only daughter, Constanza Connie Corleone, was getting married. Hundreds of guests filled the gardens. Politicians, judges, businessmen, soldiers, and even a few faces who looked too clean to be truly honest. Men in dark suits smoked cigars while women in pastel dresses swirled to the rhythm of the tarantella. Every guest came bearing gifts, but more importantly, they came to pay respect to the man whose invisible hand reached through every corner of New York, Don Vito Corleone. Inside the Don's office, however, the mood was different. While the party outside roared with joy, inside, the Don conducted his real business. In the cool, dim light of his study, men came to ask favors. The rule was simple. No Sicilian can refuse a request on his daughter's wedding day. Vito Corleone sat behind his heavy wooden desk, calm and patient, listening. First came Amerigo Bonacera, the undertaker, his face pale with anger and grief. His daughter had been beaten by two American boys, and the law had failed him. He wanted justice, not from the courts, but from the Don. "Why did you go to the police?" the Don asked softly. "Why didn't you come to me first?" Bonacera trembled, ashamed. He wanted revenge, but he had doubted the Don's power. Vito's words were gentle, but the message was steel beneath silk. Finally, when Bonacera bowed and kissed the Don's hand, the old man nodded. Justice would be done, the Corleone way. Outside, Sonny Corleone, the Don's hot-blooded eldest son, flirted openly with a bridesmaid, his wife glancing on from afar with quiet fury. Tom Hagen, the calm, intelligent consigliere, the family's lawyer and adopted son, moved through the crowd, organizing gifts and people with effortless precision. Fredo, the second son, drank too much and laughed too loudly. And then there was Michael, the youngest, a decorated war hero in his uniform, standing slightly apart from it all. Kay Adams, his American girlfriend, watched as Michael pointed discreetly to a man being escorted inside. He told her stories, about how his father once protected a singer named Johnny Fontaine, and how the Don made someone an offer he couldn't refuse. Kay laughed, half believing, half afraid. Michael smiled faintly. "That's my family, Kay," he said. "It's not me." But deep down, a shadow passed across his eyes, a faint premonition of the man he would one day become. As night fell, fireworks burst over the Corleone estate. Connie and her groom, Carlo Rizzi, danced their first dance as husband and wife. The band played louder. Toasts were made. Envelopes of cash exchanged hands. To the guests, it was a day of happiness. But to those who understood power, it was a day of accounting. Debts called in, alliances renewed, promises made. Inside, the Don rose slowly from his chair. He had spent the day granting favors, balancing the scales of power with quiet authority. When he finally stepped outside to join his family, the crowd parted like water around a ship. Everyone rose to greet him, the Godfather. He smiled modestly and kissed his daughter. But even in celebration, his eyes were alert, measuring every gesture, every whisper. For Don Vito Corleone knew better than anyone. Peace was only ever a moment between wars. Part 2, The Don. The next morning, the house was quieter, but not silent. The servants cleared tables, musicians packed their instruments, and the scent of cigars still lingered in the warm summer air. For most people, the wedding was over. For Don Vito Corleone, it was back to business. In his office, sunlight cut thin lines across the heavy curtains. A man sat across from him, Nazarene the baker, nervous but respectful. He needed help for a young Sicilian immigrant named Enzo, who had fallen in love with his daughter. Enzo's visa was about to expire. The Don listened patiently, his hands folded, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Tom Hagen. "See that this boy stays," he said simply. "A baker who works hard deserves a family." To the Don, loyalty and gratitude were the foundation of power, not greed. He didn't just demand respect, he created it. Every favor granted bound people to him in invisible threads, a web of obligation stronger than chains. Later that day, Johnny Fontaine, the famous singer, arrived from Hollywood. His face was handsome but strained, his voice full of desperation. He needed a role in a movie that would save his fading career, but the studio head refused to cast him. Johnny was family, Don Vito's godson. He begged for help. The Don listened quietly, then stood and placed his hand on Johnny's shoulder. "You can act like a man," he barked suddenly, startling everyone in the room. "Is this what you've become? A Hollywood Pinocchio who cries like a woman?" Then, his anger melted back into calm. "I'll make him an offer he can't refuse," he said softly. 2 days later, the studio head woke up to find a bloody horse's head in his bed. The Don's promise, delivered with surgical precision. Johnny got the role. The world never knew how. But everyone who mattered understood the message. Don Corleone's influence was limitless. The Don's world. To outsiders, Don Vito Corleone was a criminal, a man who built an empire on gambling, smuggling, and protection rackets. But to those who knew him, he was something more, a peacemaker, a judge, a patriarch. His office was a court where justice could be bought. Yes, but it was also where fairness could be found when the American system failed. He gave to the poor, funded churches, helped immigrants start businesses. His men, Clemenza, Tessio, and Luca Brozzi, were loyal soldiers, bound by honor. They would kill for him, but more importantly, they would die for him. Vito Corleone never raised his voice. He didn't need to. A nod, a whisper, a single look. That was enough. His true genius was patience. He never acted out of impulse. He waited until his enemies revealed themselves. The meeting with Sollozzo. But change was coming. The world was shifting, from respect to greed, from the old ways to something darker. That change arrived in the form of Virgil, the Turk, Sollozzo, a rising narcotics dealer backed by the rival Tattaglia family. Sollozzo requested a meeting with Don Corleone. He was ambitious, smooth, confident, a man of the new generation. He wanted the Don's political protection and police connections in exchange for a share of the drug trade. The profits would be enormous. The Don listened carefully, his face unreadable. Sonny leaned forward, interested. The Don noticed. When Sollozzo finished his pitch, Vito finally spoke, softly, but his words cut like a knife. I must refuse. I have no desire to be mixed up in drugs. A man who builds his fortune on narcotics loses the respect of others. It will destroy everything we have built. Sollozzo's smile froze. The refusal wasn't just business. It was a message. You are not one of us. After the meeting, the Don turned to Tom. I want no part of this drug business, understand? It's dangerous. It brings heat. And it will destroy the families. But deep down, he knew something had shifted. The young men, Sonny, Sollozzo, even other Dons, were hungry for power, not respect. And that hunger was poison. The seeds of betrayal. That night, Vito sat in his garden, surrounded by the quiet hum of crickets. He looked at the roses he tended with such care. Fragile things that thrived only under discipline and patience. He thought of Michael, his youngest, still untouched by the family business. Perhaps that was his one true victory, to give his son a clean life. He sighed. A man who doesn't spend time with his family can never be a real man, he had told Sonny once. But could Michael ever be free? Could any son escape his father's shadow? Inside, Luca Brozzi rehearsed his speech. Tomorrow, he would meet Sollozzo, pretending to defect. A dangerous mission. The Don trusted him completely. Yet, even the most loyal man could not stop what was coming. End of part 2. As night settled over the Corleone estate, the empire of Don Vito stood tall. Powerful, respected, untouchable. But beneath the calm surface, cracks had begun to form. Greed whispered in the dark. Betrayal took its first breath. And somewhere in the city, a gunman was loading his weapon. Part 3. The shooting. Autumn arrived quietly in New York. The leaves along the sidewalks turned to copper, the air crisp and sharp. But inside the city's underworld, the season brought not peace, but danger. Don Vito Corleone, still refusing to involve himself in narcotics, had unknowingly stepped into a trap. The Tattaglia family, backed by Sollozzo, the Turk, saw his refusal not as prudence, but as defiance. And defiance, in their world, demanded punishment. The setup. Early one cold morning, the Don's black Cadillac rolled down a quiet street in Little Italy. The old man sat in the back seat, calm as always, wrapped in a dark overcoat. His driver had the day off, so Fred Corleone, his second son, had been asked to drive. Though Fredo wasn't built for danger. He was soft-spoken, nervous, too gentle for the life he was born into. They stopped near Genco Olive Oil Company, the Don's business front. Vito stepped out to buy fruit from a street vendor. A simple act, something he'd done hundreds of times. He smiled at the shopkeeper, selecting oranges one by one, the way a man does when his heart is at ease. Then the black sedan appeared from the corner. Too fast, too quiet. The first shot cracked the morning air like lightning. Then another. And another. Oranges spilled across the pavement as Don Vito Corleone fell, blood blooming across his coat. Fredo screamed, froze, dropped his gun. The car sped away, its tires screaming as it disappeared down the street. The great Don lay bleeding in the gutter, his body fragile, his hands still reaching for the fruit that had scattered like coins. The family reacts. News spread through the underworld faster than any newspaper could print it. The Godfather's been shot. Inside the Corleone compound, chaos reigned. Sonny Corleone exploded with rage, throwing chairs, cursing, swearing vengeance. His father, the man who had built their empire, was fighting for his life in a hospital bed. The streets buzzed with rumors. The Tattaglias had struck first, Sollozzo was behind it, and the war had begun. Tom Hagen, calm even in crisis, immediately began organizing. He called in their soldiers, reinforced their territories, reached out to allies. He knew that if Don Vito died, every rival family would move against them like wolves. Sonny slammed his fist on the table. We heat now. All of them, Sollozzo, Tattaglia, everyone. Tom shook his head. If we go to war now, we lose everything. We need to think. But thinking had never been Sonny's gift. His heart burned too fast, too hot. He wanted blood. Meanwhile, Michael Corleone, far from the family compound, read the news in a cafe with Kay. His face went pale. Without a word, he stood, buttoned his coat, and said quietly, I have to go home. Kay looked into his eyes and saw something there. Something hard, ancient, and cold. The soldier was gone. The son was returning to the family he had tried to escape. The Sollozzo trap. Days later, Don Vito's condition remained uncertain. The hospitals were under guard. But Sollozzo wasn't finished. He kidnapped Tom Hagen, knowing that the consigliere was the brain of the family. In a dimly lit room, Sollozzo spoke calmly, almost politely. Your Don is finished. Sonny's hot-headed. You can talk sense to him. Let's make peace, under my terms. Tom said little. He listened. He knew Sollozzo was afraid that Don Vito might live. Because if the Don survived, no corner of New York would be safe for Sollozzo. When Tom was released, he returned to the family and delivered the message. Sonny was still ready for war, but the news that his father was alive barely steadied him. For now, Michael's awakening. A few nights later, Michael visited his father at the hospital. It was quiet, too quiet. The guards who were supposed to protect the Don were gone. The front desk clerk looked nervous. The hallway lights flickered. Something was wrong. Michael's instincts, the same instincts that had kept him alive in war, came alive. He moved quickly, wheeling his father's bed into another room. Don't be afraid, he whispered to the unconscious old man. I'm with you now. Then he went outside and saw headlights turning the corner. 2 men approaching, slow and deliberate. Hitmen. Michael's heart raced. He grabbed a passing baker, Enzo, the same man his father had once helped, and told him to stand by the door. Together they stood guard, pretending to have guns in their pockets. The men in the car hesitated, saw the silhouettes, and drove away. Sirens wailed moments later. Police arrived, led by Captain McCluskey, a corrupt officer bought by Sollozzo. He struck Michael across the face, breaking his jaw, a message of who really controlled the streets. But something had changed inside Michael. He had stepped into the world he'd once rejected. Not out of greed, but out of love. And he could never leave it again. The meeting. Days later, Michael sat with Sonny, Tom, and Clemenza, his face still bruised but his eyes burning with a new clarity. Sollozzo wanted to negotiate again. The family debated what to do. Then Michael spoke, calm, deliberate, cold. I'll meet him. The room fell silent. You? You're not a killer, Sonny said, half laughing. They'll never expect me, Michael replied. That's my advantage. He laid out the plan with surgical precision. They'd set up a meeting with Sollozzo and Captain McCluskey in a quiet Bronx restaurant. Clemenza would hide a gun in the bathroom. Michael would go unarmed, appear harmless. Then, when the time came, he'd do what had to be done. No one argued. For the first time, Michael sounded like a Corleone. End of part 3. The night before the meeting, Michael sat alone in his room. Kay's picture was on the table. His father's voice echoed in his memory. A man who doesn't spend time with his family can never be a real man. Outside, rain began to fall. Inside, Michael Corleone, the war hero, the outsider, the son who swore he'd never be part of it, was about to make a choice that would change everything. Part 4. The Sicilian Message. New York's winter had settled heavy over the city, the kind that froze the streets and muffled the sound of traffic. In a small Bronx restaurant, a plan was already in motion that would change the balance of power forever. Michael Corleone sat quietly in the back seat of the car, sandwiched between Sollozzo the Turk and Captain McCluskey, the corrupt police officer who had broken his jaw. The car rattled through dark, empty streets, heading toward the meeting spot. No one spoke. Michael's face was calm, almost serene. His bruise had faded to a faint yellow shadow, but his eyes were cold steel. He looked like a man who had already made peace with what was about to happen. The dinner meeting. The restaurant was small, old, and quiet. Red checkered tablecloths, faded wallpaper, the smell of garlic and wine hanging in the air. A train rumbled outside every few minutes, shaking the glasses on the table. It was the kind of place where men could talk privately, or die silently. Sollozzo spoke first, his tone calm, almost paternal. I'm sorry about the old man, Mike. It was business. I respect your father. We can still make peace, eh? Michael listened without expression. The words floated in the air, meaningless. McCluskey ate spaghetti noisily, ignoring them both. The Don's world had always been one of rules and honor. But this was something else. Sollozzo's world was greed wrapped in civility. It disgusted him. A waiter came by with a bottle of wine, and Michael excused himself. He walked toward the bathroom. Sollozzo's eyes flicked up, a flash of suspicion, then back to his glass. McCluskey didn't care. He was still chewing. Inside the narrow bathroom, Michael's heartbeat filled his ears. The gun Clemenza had hidden was taped behind the tank, cold metal against cold tile. He found it, held it, breathed once, then twice. He felt the weight in his hand, heavy, final. When he returned to the table, the sound of the train roared through the walls again, louder this time, like thunder tearing the night apart. Sollozzo started to speak. What I want. Michael fired 2 shots into his head, then turned the gun and shot McCluskey once through the throat. The noise was deafening. The air filled with smoke and silence. Michael dropped the gun, stepped out into the night, and vanished. The aftermath. By dawn, the city was chaos. Sollozzo dead. McCluskey dead. The Corleones had struck back with surgical precision. It wasn't just revenge, it was a message. A Sicilian message. To kill a police captain, even a corrupt one, was an unthinkable act. It broke the rules of both the law and the Mafia. There was no going back. The newspapers screamed headlines. Politicians howled for justice. Every other crime family in New York held its breath. But Don Vito Corleone, still recovering in bed, said nothing. His youngest son had done what no one expected, and in doing so, he had rewritten the rules of the game. Exile. That night, Michael disappeared. A small plane carried him across the ocean to Sicily, the old country, the land of his father's birth. He traveled under a false name, protected by the Corleone family's allies in Palermo. The mountains rose like sleeping beasts, the villages were carved into the rock, ancient and silent. In Sicily, time moved differently. Days were long, slow, and sun-drenched. The air smelled of olive trees and dust. Michael found refuge under the watch of Don Tomasino, an old friend of his father, who controlled the local villages. For the first time in months, he could breathe. But peace never meant safety. Apollonia. One morning, while walking through a small hill town, Michael saw her, Apollonia Vitelli. She was young, radiant, her black hair shining like midnight against the sunlight. She laughed once, and the world seemed to stop. Love, sudden and total, hit him like a bullet. It wasn't lust or obsession, it was fate. He asked the local men about her. They warned him, her father was strict, her family proud. But Michael was a Corleone, he understood respect. He came to the Vitelli house formally, introduced himself as an honest businessman from America. Her father saw the honor in his eyes, the strength in his silence. In the weeks that followed, Michael courted her in the old Sicilian way. Always with chaperones, always proper, always with the quiet intensity of a man who knew his time was borrowed. They walked under olive trees. They spoke little. They didn't need to. When he asked for her hand, the whole village turned out for the wedding. The day was golden. Apollonia, in her white veil, looked like the promise of redemption. For a brief moment, Michael felt something he hadn't felt since before the shooting. Innocence. The shadow of revenge. But Sicily is a land where history clings like dust, and no man truly escapes his past. Back in America, the war between the five families burned hotter than ever. Sonny led the Corleones with fire and fury, hitting Tattaglia fronts, burning warehouses, spilling blood on every street. The city trembled. Don Vito, finally out of the hospital, watched helplessly. His heart ached. One son in exile, one consumed by rage. Then word came from Sicily. One of Michael's guards, Fabrizio, the quiet one, had betrayed him. He had been bought. And he had planted a bomb in Michael's car. That morning, Michael handed Apollonia the keys. "Come on, Bella," he smiled. "Let's take a drive." She laughed, ran toward the car, and in an instant the world exploded. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but flame, metal, and silence. Michael was thrown backward, stunned, alive, and utterly destroyed. Apollonia was gone. The man who remained. In the burning ruins of that life, something inside Michael died, too. The last piece of innocence, the last dream of escape. He had seen war, blood, betrayal, and now, loss beyond repair. He stood in the ashes, his face blank, the wind whipping smoke across his eyes. For the first time, he understood what his father had always known. Power isn't freedom. It's survival. When he finally left Sicily years later, he was no longer a young man running from his family. He was a Corleone returning home. End of part 4. Across the ocean, New York waited, restless, broken, and ready for new blood. Don Vito's enemies were closing in. Sonny's fury was tearing the family apart. And somewhere in the shadows, a new Don was being born. Part 5, The Return. It was late autumn when Michael Corleone came home. The air in New York smelled of rain and gasoline. The skyline glittered like steel under a bruised sky. The war between the five families had burned for more than a year, and though peace was finally being whispered, the cost had been unbearable. Michael's ship docked quietly, without announcement. His face was older now, his eyes colder. Sicily had carved away his youth, leaving something sharper, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous. He was met by Tom Hagen, the family's consigliere. They embraced briefly, not as old friends, but as men who had both seen too much. "How's my father?" Michael asked. "He's older," Tom said carefully. "Tired. But he's alive. He's waiting for you." They drove through the night, the city lights sliding across Michael's face. He said nothing, but every corner, every alley felt haunted, ghosts of his past lives, his past choices. The war's toll. At the Corleone compound, silence reigned. The grand house that once throbbed with music and laughter now felt like a fortress under siege. Guards patrolled the gates. Every window was watched. Every car that approached was checked twice. Don Vito Corleone sat in a high-backed chair by the window, a blanket draped across his knees. His hair had turned silver. His voice was still steady, but softer now, like the wind before sunset. When Michael entered, the Don turned his head slowly and smiled. It was a father's smile, proud, sad knowing. "My son," he said quietly. "You're home." They spoke little that night. There was no need. The Don could see what Sicily had done. And Michael, looking at his father, could see what the war had taken. The loss of Sonny. Later, Tom told him the rest. Sonny Corleone, the brother who once ruled with fire and rage, was dead. He had been ambushed at the Jones Beach Causeway, betrayed by Carlo Rizzi, Connie's husband. Dozens of bullets had torn through his body. The killers had waited for him like hunters. Michael listened in silence. His jaw tightened, but his eyes stayed dry. It wasn't shock, it was focus. "Who gave the order?" he asked. "Barzini," Tom said. "But he used Tattaglia and Carlo to set it up." Michael nodded once. There was no shouting, no anger. Just the quiet click of destiny, falling into place. The Don's peace. In the months that followed, Don Vito called a meeting with the rival families. He stood before them not as the feared Godfather, but as an old man weary of death. He offered peace, an end to the bloodshed. The other Dons agreed. The war, officially, was over. But Vito Corleone was not naive. He knew the peace was temporary. He knew the men around that table. Barzini, Tattaglia, Strachey, smiled with their mouths and plotted with their hearts. When the meeting ended, the Don leaned toward Tom and whispered, "Watch them. Especially Barzini. He's the true enemy." Then he turned to Michael. "There wasn't enough time, Michael. I wanted you to be different, to be Senator Corleone, Governor Corleone. But now you'll be the one they come for. You'll have to be strong." Michael said nothing. He just took his father's hand and held it. A family rebuilt. Under Michael's quiet direction, the Corleone empire began to reorganize. He didn't bark orders like Sonny, or charm men like Vito. He simply decided, and things happened. He met with Clemenza and Tessio, strengthened alliances, and quietly restructured every operation. He moved the family's business interests west, toward Nevada, where casinos and hotels were becoming the new frontier of power. He visited Kay Adams again, after years of silence. She was older now, wary, and still hurt by his disappearance. He stood at her door in the rain. "I came back for you," he said. "You left without a word, Michael. They said you killed a police captain." "I didn't say I was perfect," he replied softly. "But I'm free now. And I need you." Kay hesitated. But there was something magnetic in him, something inevitable. Against every warning in her heart, she said yes. Their marriage was quiet, almost secretive. Michael promised her they would live a life of legitimacy, that the Corleone name would one day be clean. He believed it when he said it. Maybe. The shadow of betrayal. Don Vito's health continued to decline. He spent his days in the garden, trimming tomato vines, his grandson playing at his feet. The sun was warm, and for the first time in years, he looked peaceful. But behind that peace, the Don still played the long game. He taught Michael everything, the old codes, the old ways, the politics behind every favor. He told him who could be trusted, who could not. He told him how to listen to a man's tone, not his words. "Remember, Michael," he said one afternoon, "whoever comes to you to arrange a meeting with Barzini, that's the traitor." Michael nodded. He understood. The lesson was written in stone. The Don's farewell. Then came the spring afternoon, when the world seemed too gentle to hold death. Don Vito Corleone was in his garden, chasing his grandson through rows of tomatoes. The child laughed, the old man smiled. His hat fell, his heart faltered, and quietly, without pain, the Godfather died among his vines. When Michael found him, he knelt beside the body, and placed his hand on his father's chest. The garden was silent except for the rustle of leaves. It felt as if the earth itself had stopped to mourn. The king was gone, and the prince had no choice but to wear the crown. End of part 5. That night, the family gathered in mourning. The candles burned low. The air smelled of flowers and gun oil. And in the dim light, Michael sat alone at his father's desk, the same desk where, years ago, a young man had once said, "That's my family, Kay. It's not me." Now it was him. Entirely. And the world would soon learn what kind of Don Michael Corleone would become. Part 6. The Baptism of Blood. The Corleone estate had fallen into a strange quiet. After Don Vito's death, it felt as though the air itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what the youngest son would do. Michael Corleone sat in his father's chair, the heavy oak desk stretching before him like an altar. In front of him lay a dozen open folders, ledgers, contracts, lists of names. Each page whispered of favors, debts, and blood. Tom Hagen stood by the window, arms folded, his face unreadable. "They think you're weak," Tom said quietly. "They think you'll seek peace like your father did." "That's what I want them to think," Michael replied. Outside, the rain started to fall. Inside, the world was about to change. The family moves west. Michael's first act as head of the family was relocation. The Corleones would no longer live in New York. The new empire would rise in Las Vegas, the desert kingdom where money flowed cleaner than blood. He sent Fredo ahead to manage contacts with Mo Green, a casino owner with a reputation for arrogance. Fredo, eager to prove himself, tried to act like a man of influence. But to the real players, he was just the Don's soft brother. Meanwhile, Michael called a meeting with the remaining heads of the 5 families. The setting was elegant, the tone polite, but under every word lay a pulse of danger. Michael announced that the Corleones were going legitimate, that he intended to sell all interests in gambling and narcotics, and invest solely in clean enterprises. The other Dons nodded, smiled, agreed, and plotted. Because everyone in the room knew, no man leaves the underworld alive. The warning. Behind closed doors, Clemenza and Tessio whispered of old times. Both were veterans, loyal once to Don Vito, but each with his own ambitions. Clemenza, round and affable, swore loyalty to Michael. Tessio, sharp and practical, kept his silence, too calculating, too careful. And then came the news. Barzini wanted a meeting. He sent word through Tessio. When Tom Hagen told Michael, the world seemed to slow down. He remembered his father's voice, soft but certain. "Whoever comes to you to arrange a meeting with Barzini, that's the traitor." Michael didn't react. He simply nodded. "Tell him it will be done," he said calmly. He knew then that the game was over. The time for peace was finished. The time for vengeance, cold, patient, absolute, had come. The baptism. A few days later, Connie Corleone's child, Michael's nephew, was to be baptized in the old cathedral. The church was filled with light, candles flickering, organ music swelling like waves. Michael stood at the altar, dressed impeccably, a godfather in every sense of the word. Beside him stood Kay, serene and radiant, holding the child. The priest's voice echoed through the vast stone hall. "Do you renounce Satan?" I do renounce him, Michael said softly. And all his works. I do renounce them. Outside the church, the city was not quiet. It was a storm of motion. Engines starting, doors slamming, footsteps echoing in stairwells. Michael's orders had gone out hours ago. The purge. At that same moment, all across New York, the old world began to die. Mo Green lay on a massage table in Las Vegas, a hot towel over his eyes, ranting about respect. The masseur stepped aside. A man in a dark suit pressed a pistol to Mo's temple, and pulled the trigger. A red mist bloomed against the white tile. Don Strachey was stepping out of his car when a pair of gunmen emerged from a delivery truck, cutting him down in a storm of bullets. Don Cuneo tried to escape through a revolving door. He was caught halfway through when a shotgun blast shattered the glass and sent him spinning lifelessly. Don Tatalia was found in a hotel bed, the sheets stained crimson, his mistress screaming. And finally, Don Barzini, the puppet master behind the war, strode confidently down courthouse steps, until a uniformed officer approached, saluted, and drew a gun from beneath his jacket. The bullets struck Barzini's chest. He fell backward, disbelief in his eyes. At the same instant, the priest's voice in the cathedral intoned. Michael Francis Rizzi, do you believe in God, the Father Almighty? I do believe, Michael whispered. The choir rose. The organ thundered. And somewhere, gunfire echoed like thunder from another world. The aftermath. When it was done, Michael left the church quietly. The sun broke through the clouds, painting the city gold. He looked peaceful, calm, almost holy. No one around him, not even Kay, knew that the blood of 5 men still steamed on the pavement of New York. Later that day, Tessio was brought before him, the final loose thread. The old capo was calm, even resigned. Tell Mike it was only business, Tessio said to Tom Hagen. I always liked him. But business was business. Tessio was taken away, and he never came back. The confrontation. That evening, in the Don's office, Connie burst in, her face streaked with tears. She screamed that Michael had killed her husband, Carlo Rizzi. Tom tried to calm her, but she was inconsolable. Michael stood silently behind his desk. His face was stone. When Connie was gone, Kay turned to him. Michael, did you? He looked at her, calm, steady. Don't ask me about my business, Kay. She pressed again. Is it true? No, he said simply. There was a long pause. Then she smiled faintly, relieved, half believing him. She left the room as his capo entered, Clemenza, Rocco, Alneri. They kissed Michael's hand, one by one murmuring. Don Corleone. As the office door closed, Kay turned just in time to see a man bow his head before her husband. The truth crashed over her like cold water. The door shut. The last light disappeared. And Michael Corleone, the good son, the war hero, the boy who once wanted nothing to do with the family business, had become the Godfather. End of part 6. The cycle was complete. The son had inherited the father's sins, but perfected them. Where Vito Corleone ruled by respect and affection, Michael ruled by fear and precision. The world had changed, and the new Godfather would rule it in silence. Part 7. The Golden Empire. The war was over. The Corleones had won. The newspapers called it a peaceful transition of power. The politicians smiled. The city breathed easier. But beneath the calm surface, the underworld knew the truth. A new order had risen, colder, cleaner, and far more dangerous than before. Michael Corleone was now Don Corleone, and his word was law. A new beginning in the West. The Corleone compound in Long Beach was sold. The gates that had once guarded the family's kingdom now stood open, rusting in the sea air. The family moved west, to Nevada, where the desert stretched endless and empty, and fortunes were built on sand, neon, and sin. Las Vegas was a mirage of light in the night. Casinos glittered like temples. Music poured from every doorway. The smell of bourbon and perfume hung heavy in the air. Here, Michael saw the future. A place where power wore tuxedos instead of trench coats, and deals were made in boardrooms instead of alleyways. He stood on the balcony of his suite at the Flamingo Hotel, watching the lights burn against the horizon. Kay came up behind him, resting a hand on his shoulder. It's beautiful, she said softly. It's clean, he answered. That's what matters now. But even as he said it, the words tasted like ash. Fredo's failure. Fredo Corleone had been living in Las Vegas for months, trying to prove himself. He was charming but foolish, a man who mistook access for power. He drank too much, gambled too much, talked too freely. To the casino bosses, he was a harmless clown. To Michael, he was a liability. During one tense meeting, Mo Green, still fuming over his treatment, shouted at Michael in front of Fredo and his men. I made this town. You don't come to me and tell me how to run my business. Fredo tried to calm him. Mike, he's right, maybe we should. Michael's eyes cut through him like glass. Don't ever take sides against the family again, he said quietly. Ever. The room froze. Fredo lowered his head, his face burning with shame. That moment, small and quiet, was the crack that would one day split the Corleone bloodline in two. The business of legitimacy. Michael's plan was clear. Within 5 years, every Corleone operation would be legitimate. He met with senators, developers, and financiers. Men who smiled wider and lied smoother than gangsters ever could. He bought hotels, casinos, construction firms. He washed the family's blood money until it gleamed like gold. He spoke softly, smiled rarely, and made deals that rewrote the map of power in Nevada. Tom Hagen, still his consigliere, watched with a mixture of admiration and unease. "You're becoming what your father wanted, Mike," he said one night. Michael looked out at the skyline. "No," he replied. "I'm becoming what I have to be." The distance. At home, Kay tried to hold on to the man she once knew. They had 2 children now, Anthony and Mary. The house was beautiful, quiet, filled with sunlight. But Michael was almost never there. When he was distant, gentle but unreachable, as if his soul existed in another world. Sometimes she'd wake in the night to find him standing by the window, smoking in silence, staring at nothing. "What are you thinking about?" she'd ask. "My father," he'd say, and what he would have done differently. But she knew it wasn't his father he was thinking of. It was the men he'd killed. The choices that couldn't be undone. Ghosts in the garden. One afternoon, Michael visited his father's old house in Long Beach. Now abandoned, the garden overgrown. He walked the paths where Don Vito once played with his grandson, the air thick with memories. He knelt by the tomato vines, brushing dust from the soil, and whispered, "I did it, Pop. I made it all clean. Just like you wanted." But the wind carried no answer. Only the rustling of leaves, and the echo of laughter long gone. The cost of power. As the years passed, the Corleone name became more respectable, and more feared. Politicians courted Michael. Judges dined at his table. He no longer needed to order executions. People simply obeyed, out of habit or terror. But legitimacy came at a price. Clemenza died of a heart attack. Tessio was long gone. Rocco disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Tom Hagen grew weary, distant, burdened by the moral weight of everything he'd helped build. Fredo drifted into the background, his smile thinner every year. And Connie, once broken by Carlo's death, hardened into something sharp and hollow. A woman who understood the family better than anyone. The empire glittered, but inside, it was hollowing out. Kay's awakening. One evening, Kay confronted Michael after hearing rumors. Whispers that his legitimate empire still ran on blood. "Michael, you said it would be different. You said our children would never live like this." He looked at her, calm as always. "They won't." "Then tell me the truth," she said, her voice trembling. "Tell me you didn't have them killed." He didn't answer. That silence was her answer. Kay turned away, tears in her eyes. "You'll never change," she whispered. "You've become everything you hated." Michael stood there, motionless. The light from the chandelier fell across his face, cutting half of it in shadow. He didn't stop her when she walked out. The Godfather alone. Late that night, Michael sat alone in his office. The doors were closed. The world outside was silent except for the desert wind. He reached for a glass of whiskey and stared at the photographs on his desk. His father, his brothers, his mother, his wife, his children. Everyone he had loved was either dead, distant, or afraid of him. He had built his father's dream and surpassed it. But somewhere along the way, he had become the very thing his father feared. A man who ruled without heart, without mercy, without peace. He rose, walked to the window, and looked out at the city his power had built. The neon lights flickered like dying stars. "We're legitimate," he said softly to no one. But even he didn't believe it anymore. The final image. Outside, the desert stretched into eternity, golden, silent, unforgiving. Michael Corleone stood alone in the glow of his empire, the most powerful man in America, and the loneliest soul alive. The camera would pull back slowly, leaving him small against the vast window, the music swelling like a requiem. In that silence, one truth remained. Power had given him everything, and taken everything that mattered. End of Part 7, The Golden Empire. The saga closes not with blood, but with emptiness. The boy who once wanted to escape his father's world now was that world. A king in exile, ruling over dust and ghosts. Part 8, The Fall of the Godfather. The years passed quietly, like sand slipping through an hourglass. The headlines forgot the Corleones. The politicians who once courted Michael now shook hands with younger, hungrier men. The casinos still glowed, the hotels still filled, but Michael Corleone, once the most feared man in America, had begun to fade into legend. He lived in a mansion near Lake Tahoe, far from the noise of cities and the stench of deals. Snow covered the mountains, the lake reflected the sky, and every morning he would walk alone by the water, coat collar turned up, his breath a ghost in the cold air. He was barely 50, but he looked older, his hair touched with grey, his eyes tired. There was still strength in him, but it had hardened into something cold, unmovable, eternal. The weight of legacy. Inside the house, the halls were filled with silence. Kay had left him years ago. She took the children, her heart too wounded to stay, though part of her still pitied him. Their son, Anthony, was growing into a man, quiet, thoughtful, more like his father than he realized. Their daughter, Mary, was soft and gentle, a reflection of everything Michael had lost. He would receive letters sometimes, updates written in careful, distant words. He never replied, but he read each one until the paper creased and yellowed. In the stillness of night, he would sit by the fire and stare at his father's old photograph. The proud, calm face of Don Vito Corleone looking back at him. "I did what you taught me," he would whisper. "I protected the family. I made us strong." But the words no longer comforted him, because the family he had protected no longer existed. Fredo's shadow. Fredo's death haunted him more than any other. He never spoke of it, not to Tom, not to Kay, not to anyone. But every time he stood near water, he thought of that quiet day on the lake, the gunshot echoing across the ripples, and the silence that followed. It was the one act he could never forgive himself for, not even under the logic of family business. In his dreams, Fredo still smiled, still called him Mike, still reached for his hand as the boat drifted away. And every time Michael woke, his palms were cold and wet, as if he'd just pulled his brother from the water. Too late. The death of Tom Hagen. When Tom Hagen died, Michael didn't cry. He attended the funeral in a dark coat, standing apart from the crowd. The priest spoke of loyalty, integrity, brotherhood, all the things that once defined them both. As the coffin was lowered, snow began to fall. Michael closed his eyes, and for a moment, he saw not the lawyer or the consigliere, but the young man who once stood beside him in Sicily, steady and unflinching. "We did what we had to do," he murmured. "Didn't we, Tom?" But there was no answer, only the whisper of wind through pine trees. The empire without an heir. By the 1970s, Michael Corleone's name was carved into the bones of America. The Corleone Group owned real estate, resorts, construction firms, and casinos from New York to Havana. He was richer than kings, more powerful than presidents, and utterly alone. He had built a fortress of wealth around himself, but it could not keep out time. Every friend was gone. Every brother dead. Even his mother's house, where the smell of wine and basil once filled the air, had been sold and demolished. The world had changed, and Michael no longer knew how to belong to it. Kay's return. One winter, Kay returned. She arrived unannounced, grey hair under her scarf, her face still beautiful in its sadness. Anthony was studying music now. Mary was grown, radiant, and kind, untouched by her father's shadow, or so she hoped. Kay stood in the doorway as Michael approached. They looked at each other for a long time, two strangers bound by love and regret. "I didn't come to forgive you," she said softly. "I came to let you go." "You already did," he replied. But when she turned to leave, his voice broke slightly. "Tell the children. I always wanted better for them." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "That's what breaks my heart, Michael. You did." And then she was gone again, her footsteps fading down the marble hall like memories. The desert of the soul. At night, Michael would sit by the lake, watching the moonlight ripple across the surface. The silence was heavy, almost sacred. Sometimes he thought he heard the faint strains of a trumpet, the echo of Anthony's music, carried on the wind. He remembered his father's words. "A man who doesn't spend time with his family can never be a real man." He had spent his life protecting them from the world, and in doing so, had become the thing they most needed protection from. The confession. One morning, he visited a small chapel in Reno. It was empty except for an old priest sweeping the floor. Michael knelt, his hands trembling, his eyes hollow. "I have blood on my hands," he whispered. "I've killed men. I've destroyed everything I loved." The priest, not recognizing him, said gently, "Then you must pray for forgiveness." "Would God forgive me?" "Do you forgive yourself?" "No," Michael said. "And I never will." He left before dawn, walking into the mist, the bells tolling behind him like the heartbeat of time. The last morning. Years later, Michael Corleone sat alone in a villa in Sicily, the land where his transformation had begun. The air was dry and sweet. The sun was soft. The wind smelled of oranges and sea salt. He was old now, thin, his hands shaking as he lifted his cup of coffee. No guards. No family. Just silence. The kind that belongs to men who have outlived their own legend. A small dog played in the dust near his chair, chasing shadows. Michael smiled faintly. For the first time in decades, he felt something like peace. Then, without warning, his hand slipped. The cup fell. The wind stilled. Michael Corleone, Don of Dons, son of Vito, ruler of empires, slumped quietly in his chair. No one screamed. No one ran. The dog barked once, then lay beside his master's feet. The camera would pull back slowly. The courtyard bathed in golden light. The old man still and small against the earth. There were no witnesses. No final words. Only silence. Epilogue, the Godfather's truth. Power had been his faith. Family had been his purpose. But in the end, both had turned to dust. Michael Corleone's story was not about crime or glory. It was about the cost of control. About a man who traded love for loyalty, and found that loyalty fades too. About a son who became his father's shadow, and could never escape it. When the sun set over Sicily that evening, no one knew that the last Godfather had died. The world went on, cars moving, children laughing, waves breaking against the shore. And in that silence, the truth lingered like incense. The more he tried to protect his family, the more he destroyed it. End of The Godfather, complete saga. The story begins with a wedding, and ends with a funeral. It spans from the warmth of loyalty to the coldness of legacy. A tragedy not of villains, but of men. Michael Corleone became what he feared most. A god among men, and a man without a soul.